Hello everyone, welcome to the Lang Focus channel and my name is Paul. Today's topic is the Scots language. Scots is a language spoken in Scotland, one of the constituent countries of the United Kingdom. Right off the bat, it's important to point out that there are essentially three different languages in Scotland: Scottish English, Scots, and Gaelic. Gaelic is a Celtic language that is only distantly related to English and Scots as an Indo-European language. Scots and Scottish English, on the other hand, are closely related to each other, though they're not the same thing. Scottish English is, for the most part, standard English but spoken with a Scottish accent. Scots, on the other hand, is distinct, having diverged from a dialect of Middle English and having features that differ from English. Some people consider Scots to be a separate language, while others consider it to be a historical dialect of English, just like the historical dialects found in England. But we'll get into that a little bit later. According to the 2011 Scottish census, just over 1.5 million people speak Scots, around 30% of the Scottish population. History. The roots of Scots lie in Northumbrian Old English, one of several Old English dialects. Northumbrian Old English was being spoken by the 7th century in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, which was located in northeastern England and part of the Scottish lowlands. The Kingdom of Scotland was founded in the year 843 with the unification of the Pictish people and Gaelic-speaking Scots. But English-speaking Northumbrian lands were not yet part of the kingdom. When the northern part of Northumbria finally became part of Scotland in the 11th century, Gaelic became the prestige language of the area, but English remained the most widely spoken language. The variety of English spoken there may have been significantly influenced by Norse, because the southern part of Northumbria, along with much of northern and eastern England, had been under Danish control, and its English dialects had been influenced by Norse. And Scandinavian settlers were also present beyond the border of that area as well. In the 12th and 13th centuries, during the Middle English period, the borough system of administrative division led to the spread of English further into Scotland. Boroughs were autonomous urban communities where traders, merchants, and craftsmen could live and do business in exchange for paying taxes on their earnings. The boroughs were ruled by nobles who answered to the king. They attracted economic migrants from other parts of Scotland, including Gaelic-speaking areas, from England, especially from areas that had been under Danish control, where Norse-influenced dialects were spoken, and from farther away places like Flanders, Frisia, and Scandinavia. English became the common language of the boroughs, but the multilingual environment created by the economic migrants had an influence on the language. So as English became more widespread in Scotland because of the boroughs, it also began to diverge from Northumbrian Middle English. Other influences were Latin, because of its role as the ecclesiastical language and the language of laws and record-keeping, and Norman French, because of the influence of King David I, who had close ties with Norman England. The divergent variety of Middle English that grew out of these influences is now referred to as Early Scots, but at the time it continued to be referred to as English until the end of the 15th century. In the 14th and 15th centuries, English replaced Gaelic in much of the lowlands, as well as replacing French as the administrative language, as well as replacing Latin as the language of records and law. Another thing that happened in the 15th century was that the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands came under Scottish rule. Scandinavian settlers had been living on these islands since the 9th century and spoke a language called Norn that derived from Old Norse. But Scots-speaking settlers began to move there, and the prestige language became Scots. From this contact, new dialects of Scots would develop with more Norse influence than other forms of Scots. These dialects are Shetland Scots and Orcadian Scots, or Orkney. By this point, Scots had become fairly distinct from English as spoken in England. One thing that set them apart was that the Southern English dialect of London was becoming the standard in England, whereas Scots had more in common with the Northern dialects. Another thing that set them apart was the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift took place between the years 1350 and 1600, more or less, and caused vowels of English to be pronounced differently. This also affected Scots, although the specific changes were different, and some vowels that changed in English remained unchanged in Scots. For example, in Middle English, the letters OU represented the sound oo. In Southern English, and thus in Standard English, this sound shifted to ow. But in Scots, it remained unchanged. So today, in Standard English, you say mouse, but in Scots, you say moose.
Moose? I'm not a moose.
And a brown cow in English is a brún cú in Scots.
Who knew brún cú?
The great vowel shift took place at about the same time that English orthography was becoming standardized, so that English spelling often reflected earlier Middle English pronunciation. And it still does today. Scots, on the other hand, was written more freely, to reflect the way it was really pronounced. An extensive body of Scots literature was written in the 15th and 16th centuries, but towards the end of that time period, as English was growing in prestige, Scots was increasingly being written using a combination of Scots and English spellings. When King James VI of Scotland became the unified monarch of England and Ireland in 1603 and began to rule from London, the influence of English continued to grow, with the Scottish upper classes adapting and anglicising their speech and writing. This is what ultimately led to the development of Scottish Standard English. Scots was still widely spoken by the common people, but with the full union of England and Scotland in 1707, it became even more discouraged and frowned upon. But the marginalization of Scots caused a rebound later that century, with a Scots literary revival led by poets such as Allan Ramsay. Later, Robert Burns, widely considered the national poet of Scotland, wrote in a combination of vernacular Scots and Scottish English. Scots language literature declined once again in the 19th century, but experienced revivals again in the 20th century. Poet Hugh MacDiarmid attempted to create a standard form of literary Scots based on a combination of different Scots varieties. Later in the 20th century, novels narrated in Scots vernacular began to appear. Is Scots a language or a dialect of English? Whether Scots is a separate language or a dialect can be a difficult question to answer, especially because these days many people use both of them in combination with each other. Today there's a diglossic situation in which people in the Scots-speaking areas can freely code switch between Scots and Standard English and combine them together in varying degrees depending on the situation. So think about that for a second. You have Scots, and then you have Standard English, which are very closely related to begin with, and people slide back and forth between the two of them, stopping anywhere along the continuum that suits the situation. In this kind of diglossic situation, it's easy to perceive both varieties as registers of a single language, to perceive Scots as a vernacular form of English. But some people still see Scots as a language in its own right, and they typically point to the body of Scots literature from over the centuries, which remained divergent from the conventions of Standard English as it developed. There's no universal standard for determining what's a language and what's a dialect. The classic quote is, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." Well, Scots began without an army, then it got one, then it lost it. And maybe it will have one again in the future. But the very least we can say is that when Scots vernacular is spoken in isolation without using Standard English, it is fairly distinct. So, what is Scots like? Well, it's a lot like English, but the main difference is in the way it's pronounced, especially the vowels. Of course, there are many different accents of English, but Scots has distinct pronunciation of its own. And unlike English, Scots is written and spelled to reflect the sounds of the spoken language. So when you read Scots, the differences become more obvious. Scots also uses its own words and expressions that are not a part of English, though some people may pepper their speech with Scots words for effect when they're speaking mainly Scottish English. Let's look at a few examples of everyday speech in Scots. The pronunciation and the spelling depends on the local variety, but these examples are from Ayrshire in the Scottish lowlands. Here's a sentence meaning, "The children caught some insects in the garden."
The bairns caught some beasties in the garden.
Right away, you'll probably notice that there are some non-English spellings, like some and garden, which is distinct in pronunciation from garden. The first vowel is different, and also notice that the D is pronounced as a glottal stop. But it's often pronounced that way in my Canadian dialect of English as well. We'd normally say garden, not garden, when speaking naturally. You'll probably notice a couple of different words here as well. There's bairns instead of children. This word is not exclusively Scots, but is also used in some English dialects of Northern England. Then we have beasties instead of insects. This is an endearing form of the word beast, which can be used to refer to small animals or insects. Here's a sentence meaning, "I went to the shop with my little brother and sister."
I went to the shop with my wee brother and sister.
Here the first thing to notice is I went. This clearly isn't the definite article a because it's followed by a verb. This is actually the first person singular personal pronoun, like I in Standard English. Next, notice te, meaning to. This can be pronounced te on its own, but here it's reduced to sound like t, just like it would normally be reduced in an English sentence like this. As in, I went to the shop. We can hear the full vowel sound in this word, we, which means with. Here, ma means my. We means little. This word is found in Standard English in certain fixed phrases like a wee bit or the wee hours of the night, but it's originally a Scots word. And in Scots, as well as Scottish English, it's very common. Notice the spelling of this word, brither, which means brother. Obviously, the difference here is just a difference in the vowel, and vowels vary like this in various English dialects as well, but in Scots they're actually spelled differently. Here, in is a reduced form of and. The pronunciation of and is often reduced in English too, but it would never be spelled like this, except maybe in a comic book or something like that. Here's a sentence meaning, I can't go to the party tonight because I've got a lot to do.
I cannae go to the party the night 'cause I've got a lot to do.
Again, we see a meaning I. Here, cannae means can't or cannot. And here's te again. Notice the equivalent word for party, which is per-i. The first vowel sound is different, and the T is pronounced like a glottal stop. Not per-ti, but per-i. Here, notice that tonight is the night in Scots, which I find quite interesting because in some other languages, like Hebrew and Arabic, you say the night or the day. 'Cause is a contraction of because. This is something that occurs in various dialects of English, including mine, but it would only be written like that in an informal context. Av is like I've in English, and to do is today. Here's a sentence meaning, I don't want to go to work today because I haven't got much energy.
I didn't want to go to work the day 'cause I haven't got much energy.
Here's a again. I guess I should have used sentences with some different pronouns. Oh well. Here's the word for don't, dine. Remember that can't was cannae, so this ending seems to be the pattern for negative contractions. Here we have te again, and here the word for work is written the way it sounds. I think this is a clear case of the great vowel shift causing a difference between the spelling and the sound in English. Here we see that today is the day, similar to the night that we saw before. Here's 'cause again, and here's another negative contraction. Haven't is hivne. All of those examples were everyday modern examples, but let's look at something a little more literary and traditional. This is an excerpt from a poem by the Scottish poet Robert Burns, who's often said to be Scotland's national poet. The poem is called Tam O'Shanter, which was written in 1790. By the way, Tam O'Shanter is also what we call these Scottish caps. These caps are named after the hero in Burns's poem. Well, here we go.
When chaplain billies leave the street, and Ruthie neighbours meet, as market days are wearing late, and folk begin to tack the gate, while we sit boozing at the nappy, getting fou and unco happy, we think nean the lang Scots mile, the mosses, water slaps and stiles, that lie between us and our hame, where sits our silky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storms, nursing her wrath to keep it warm.
In the first line, chapman billies means peddlers or traveling salespeople. In the second line, druthi means thirsty. Neighbours is equivalent to neighbours. In the third line, there are no differences, but to clarify the meaning, wearing late means getting late. In the fourth line, tack the gate means to take the road home, or I suppose, to head home. So in lines 1 to 4, Burns is creating the image of people finishing work and going home. In the fifth line, boozing means boozing, or drinking alcohol. Nappy means liquor, or ale. I guess at is used here in the same way you might say sipping at your drink. In the sixth line, we have fou, which comes from the French word fou, meaning crazy. So getting fou means getting crazy or getting drunk. Unco means very. It comes from the Old English word uncouth, meaning unknown or unusual. So I guess we could say that unco happy means unusually happy, if we want to dig into its etymology. In the seventh line, we see a different way of forming the negative. Rather than dine think, it's think nay. I think this is a poetic literary form, the same way you might write think not in English rather than don't think. Lang means long, and a Scots mile is a unit of measurement, like a mile. So this sentence says something like, we're not thinking about the long walk home. In the eighth line, mosses means marshes, slaps means steps, stiles means stiles, as in steps that lead you over a fence or a wall, and in the ninth line, hem means home. So in lines 5 to 9, Burns is creating the image of people getting drunk and not thinking about their journey home. In the ninth line, we have a different spelling for where, and dame means wife. Lines 10 and 11 are the same in English and in Scots. In the 10th line, there's the phrase, gathering her brows. I imagine her eyebrows are close together because she's scowling, making an angry face. In the 11th line, nursing her wrath to keep it warm means that she is intentionally keeping herself angry because she's planning to scold her husband. So in lines 10 to 13, Burns is creating the image of an angry wife, sitting at home waiting for a confrontation with her husband as soon as he gets home. So in that poem, we saw a little more of a literary style of Scots. Again, it's very much like English, but it has its own unique pronunciation, spelling, and vocabulary. And in the earlier examples, we saw some unique word forms and contractions. Do differences like that make Scots a separate language from English? According to a survey conducted by the Scottish government, 64% of Scottish people either slightly or strongly agree that Scots is not a language, it's just a way of speaking. And that includes 58% of the people who speak Scots most frequently. So even some Scots speakers don't really think of it as a language. And that brings me to the question of the day. For speakers of Scots, do you think of Scots as a language or as a dialect or register of English? And also, to what extent do you use Scots? And for everyone else, how similar or different do Scots and English seem to you? Leave your comments down below. Be sure to follow Lang Focus on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And as always, I would like to say thank you to all of my amazing Patreon supporters, especially these magnificent people right here on the screen for their monthly pledges. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.